Welcome to our event. It's another SBDC Stony Brook event, and many of you are familiar with our event, so you know that we only present successful programs. Take a look at the agenda. I'm going to turn this over to the director of the SBA New York District Office to say a few words to you and welcome you, and then I'll take a look.
Well, good morning. You know, it's a pleasure to be here, and I've actually have been in New York for just I think shy of 3.5 weeks. I'm actually a director in Southern California in Orange County. I understand you have an Orange County here as well, right? And but I have the opportunity to be interim director here in New York City, and the wonderful thing is, if I could just take a few moments of your time, is regardless of where it is that you are operating out of an SBA office, you find that the entrepreneurial spirit is vibrant, and the partnerships are as well with our SBDC counterparts or friends, and as well as our network of women's business centers and SCORE chapters, which are all part of the SBA, if you will, resource family. But I've had the great opportunity to be here. And when they told me about this event, I took them up right away. And I want to thank the Long Island branch office of the SBA. Walter, I believe, is here, right? He is our branch manager. But this program is very, very important. You know, I have to tell you also, sidebar here, but I have never had allergies like the ones I've had for the last 3 weeks. I am hoping that somebody in this audience has some research that will get to eradicating this thing. It's been very interesting. I don't think I normally sound like this and more congested than ever, but the SBA is fully committed to delivering programs and services that direct capital to small business owners, or opportunities for government contracting if you don't know about that. And of course, the technical assistance, the counseling and training that the SBDC program does so very well across the country. Those are very, very important programs. But then we get into other programs like the SBIR and the STTR programs, which I understand Lisa will give up a great presentation of that. You know, as I look at the agenda, I see that the second part of the program this afternoon, you're going to hear from some recipients of these grants. And I think that if you have limited knowledge about these programs that I just mentioned, what you're here for, or if you have some, nothing makes it more real. But when you hear from someone who has gone through that process, someone who has gone through the phases of the programs, who has actually been awarded, and who is putting this into practice. Do you agree with me? That's probably where we get the most value. Right before I left California, I actually had our office partnered with an organization known as Innovation Economy. And why I felt that they represented tremendous value is that organization is in the business of helping small businesses, technology companies, research companies and the like, take innovation to the commercialization point. And I think that that's the greatest challenge that many companies face. Can you guys relate with that? Yeah, in the audience? I think that is the biggest challenge. And the SBA, I think we should be very proud with our agency. I think there's 11 other agencies that participate, federal agencies in these programs. But SBA is the coordinating, what do we call it that, the administrating agency of these two programs. So I also join Gloria in inviting you to come to our offices, to come to any one of our SBDCs and those other centers that I mentioned, or to our district office, to our branch offices if you have any questions. I think we are an agency like many other federal agencies that are filled with a lot of resources, great tools, but I think you have to do this halfway. It's hard for us to know what it is that you may need. So ask. Today is the day. If you've taken time away from your business, which I commend you for doing that. I know what it is to be away from your operation. But today's the day for you to equip yourself with as much information, and if anything, get our business cards so that we can communicate with you and be able to provide information to you. So it's really a pleasure to be here today. It's my first time in Long Island, and I hope it's not going to be my last. I bring you greetings on behalf of our leadership in Washington, D.C., Karen Mills, our administrator, Deputy Johns, Marie Jones, who is our deputy administrator, some folks that have really embraced this program, and I think it's good. We're going to see some great things. So I wish you a great conference today, and I'll be here throughout the day. So I look forward to learning and hearing about the wonderful things that you all are doing. So thank you for having me.
Okay, so let's talk about Lisa. Lisa came to us. We went searching for Lisa because we wanted a Lisa, because we wanted the very best. And we got in touch with Lisa, and let's talk about Lisa. Lisa joined BBC Entrepreneurial Training and Consulting as a managing partner in 1997. The BBC team members have broad knowledge with the programs and expertise in developing persuasive proposals. Collectively, team members have coached over 1,000 applicants and have reviewed hundreds of proposals. They provide clients with assistance in identifying appropriate solicitations, guidance on proposals preparation, detailed technical reviews of proposals with extensive feedback, review and edits on draft and final versions, how-to information on energy registrations and electronic submission, and post-submission support. And believe me, the post-submission support is extremely important. Her experience in biomedical technology is extensive, having spent 15 years in product and business development and sales and product management in the industry with large publicly held corporations as well as small startups. Lisa has a BS from Brown University and an MS degree in biomedical engineering from the University of Michigan. Please give a very warm round of applause for Lisa.
We've got two things we're going to cover today, and I don't have enough time to cover it in depth. So I may or may not get through all the material that I prepared, but we're going to go over the basics of SBIR, Small Business Innovation Research, and STTR, Small Business Technology Transfer this morning. If you don't understand the rationale for the program, who's got the money, why they've got the money, what they want to spend it on, who's eligible, the rest of it isn't worthwhile. The basics are the most important, and so we're going to talk about that this morning. What we're going to talk about is a walk through the application process, but here's the deal. There's not just one application process. Turns out in the SBIR and STTR programs, and I use that word plural, there are 11 SBIR and 5 STTR programs. So there isn't one application process. There are 11 application processes and 11 agencies. So what we're going to do this afternoon, hopefully, is give you a quick tour through 3 or 4, depending on who I've got in the room, of the most typical agencies because of their size. Okay, we're going to look at Department of Defense, National Science Foundation, National Institutes of Health, and Department of Energy if we have the time. And I'll give you an overview of each of their proposal processes so that hopefully when you leave here this afternoon, you will not know everything you need to know to write a proposal. But you'll have a pretty good idea of where to get the information, what questions to ask yourself, and for some of you, you might say, thank you very much, this is not the right program for me, and I will have saved you a lot of time. Does that sound good? Okay. So I've got a team of folks we're based in Ann Arbor, Michigan, and we do tons of SBIRs, as you heard, but the one thing I want you to know is that we're not grant writers, we're not proposal writers. Those of you who want this form of money, you're going to be grant writers and proposal writers, okay? You're going to have to know how to do it. We all come out of industry and or academia, so we've all been in the same seats that you are, and now we love, love, love technology startups. We like them so early that they have no money, which is another story on how to build a consulting practice when your clients have no money. But we found over many years that we've been doing this, actually since the inception of the SBIR program in 1985, we realized that when you have technology-based entrepreneurship, where there's a high risk in getting the technology to work, there's very little money that wants to take risk. So SBIR and STTR is the place to be, and we, by necessity, have become experts over many years in this federal program because we like technology startups, okay? We don't have time to introduce everybody, but I'd like a show of hands to try and figure out who I've got in the audience. So how many of you are currently at an academic institution in some capacity? Okay, so and those of you at the academic institution, do I have any that have any federal funds, and are any of you researchers that have federal funds from any of the agencies? Okay, how many of you are with small businesses currently? Okay, the vast majority. Has anybody here written any SBIR or STTR proposals? Okay, just a couple. And if you don't mind my asking, those of you who raised your hands, has anybody been funded? What agency?
It was either Air Force or Navy.
Navy, so Department of Defense. Okay, so it sounds like most of you are new to the program, most of you are in small business, but I've got some academics, or some folks out of academia, so that helps me a little bit to target my comments. Okay, how many of you need money? I'm assuming if you didn't need money, you wouldn't be here. What we need to do is position what type of money this is. So a couple of things I'm going to reiterate throughout the morning. SBIR, Small Business Innovation Research Funds that go directly to small businesses and small businesses only. We're going to define small business in a little bit as it pertains to SBIR. STTR, Small Business Technology Transfer, a sister program. We're going to talk a little bit later this morning about the similarities and differences. Mostly similarities, so most of my comments, unless I delineate otherwise, if I just say SBIR, applies to both. STTR funding that only goes directly to small businesses. Okay, so these are small business programs. This is a form of capital that falls into the bucket of non-dilutive funding. So SBIR and STTR is a means to an end. It's a component of a funding strategy. It's not the goal. Okay? So as a small business, we're going to lay some parameters for why you should be here. Number one, you should be a small business, and I'll define that in a little bit from an SBIR perspective. Number two, you should be engaged in product development. If you're not engaged in product development, you're in the wrong place. Number three, and we're going to talk about this a little bit, the products that you are developing should be based on what we are going to call technology innovation. So how many of you have a great idea? Thank you very much. And how many of you want to turn that great idea into a product? Okay, now here's the next question. How many of you are 100% sure your product will work? Yeah, okay. This is done. Okay? And here's why I say that. And this is really the crux of what you need to start thinking about with SBIR and STTR. This is a form of what's called non-dilutive capital, or in other words, free money. If you receive an SBIR or STTR award, the only reason you would ever have to pay it back is if you do something illegal. Okay? And then you're going to pay it back with a whole lot more ramifications. But other than that, you don't have to pay it back. Here's the question you need to ask yourself. Why would the government give you free money if the goal is for you to make a big profit? Because we've already said you're a small business, the goal is to make profit. So you have to ask yourself why the government would give free money to for-profit companies. And this is, again, the crux of why SBIR and STTR exists. So let's do a scenario that you all should be fitting into. You're a small business, you've got a great idea. It's based on technological innovation, which means it's very challenging to reduce to practice. You ultimately want to turn that great idea into a product, and here's the kicker. What's the goal ultimately? To commercialize the product so you can make a lot of money. That's the goal. The goal of any SBIR or STTR project is commercialization. So you need to think about that story in your head, and you're going to need money. And there's a number of different places you can go and look for money. One, you go to the bank and borrow money. Now, banks don't like to take risk. They're low-risk lenders. So if you've got a high-risk product to develop, what do you think the chances are you're going to get a lot of bank money to do it? Yeah, not a lot, right? So now we go to another type of money, equity capital. Money that investors provide in exchange for partial ownership in your company. And now they're willing to take a lot of risk. But what do they expect in exchange for that risk? Big return. Big return. Big return, right? They have to, or they don't have a business model. Here's the thing about equity investors, though, and it's a little known secret. There's only certain kinds of risk they like to take. They're typically willing to take market risk, management risk, maybe finance risk, but what kind of risk do they typically not like to take? Technical risk. Thank you very much. So now you're stuck. You've got a great opportunity, a problem to solve in the market, an important problem, technology innovation to go in a product, but you need money to show that the technology can work. Have any of you ever gone out to raise equity capital? I don't know. Yeah. So did you ever encounter the following? Very interesting idea. Come back when? you have a prototype, you have clinical data, and you're going, yeah, but that's what I need the money. So the government in its wisdom, I know those two things I usually go there. Government in its wisdom in the 1980s noticed this funding gap. And they said from an economic development perspective in this country, we need to see technology innovation out in the market. Where's most of the innovation happening? Small businesses. But nobody wants to take technical risk. So they created the SBIR program in 1982. They then created the STTR program, its sister program, in 1992, and we'll talk about the differences a little bit, to help technology entrepreneurs impact the economy in this company by facilitating the development of the technology to get ultimately to commercialization. Thank you very much. So that's the story you have to tell. That's what you have to be doing to have this be the right source of capital. And we're going to explore how that gets translated from law through the SBA to 11 agencies that distribute the money to companies that put in competitive proposals. Okay? It is a $2.5 billion federal funding program, give or take a few shekels. If you look at statistics, PricewaterhouseCoopers puts out a venture capital survey every year. If you look at the amount of pre-seed capital, early stage capital in this country for technology-based companies, this, I think, and don't quote me on the number, is 40 to 50% of that. It's a huge pot of money for the very narrow type of company and opportunity that it's relevant for, okay? So it's a competitive and a compelling program. It only supports small businesses, so those of you who raised your hands and said you were at an academic institution, you can participate. We'll talk about how you can participate, but you can't receive the funds directly. It only goes to small businesses. You have to be developing product, and that product has to be based on technological innovation. The monies that you get in an SBIR or STTR award are restricted monies. They can only be spent to do the R&D, to go into the laboratory, conduct the research and development. So it'll pay for your R&D costs and associated overhead. But here's the kicker, and this is what makes this such a challenging program. What's the goal? Commercialization. Thank you. Commercialization, but you can't spend any of the money on any commercial-related activities. So what does that say about SBIR dollars? They can't, it's not a catch-22, but they can't be the only dollars that you're going to get. You cannot live on SBIR and STTR alone. So I'm going to go back to my comment earlier. It is a component of a funding strategy that helps facilitate getting the technology innovation lowered so that you can ultimately implement a credible commercialization strategy. So how many of you have a pretty good idea of what you do with the money tomorrow to go develop your product? Okay, good. How many of you have a pretty good idea of, assuming the product is developed, how you'll commercialize and will help you do that? You have to have both, okay, to write a competitive SBIR or STTR. And what I find the challenges tend to be are people who come to this program are typically either scientists or they're serial entrepreneurs. And the scientists understand the technical stuff, and the serial entrepreneurs understand the commercialization stuff. But it's often the case that both don't exist in the same company at the early stages, and you got to bring the two together. So again, when you leave here, you might not know exactly how to write the proposal, but I want you to think about the components that you need to pull together to have the information you need to write the competitive proposal, because that's the hard part. I often say writing a proposal is easy. The strategic planning is the hard part, okay? So it is not a source of money for basic research. We tend to talk about SBIR grants, but they're not all grants. So I talk about SBIR funding or SBIR STTR awards, and we'll talk about the different types of funding mechanisms that are used by the agencies. But it is a source of capital to help you reduce technical risk, with the long-term goal being getting a product out into the market, okay? How does this program work? How do you know if the money is there? So I lived through 3 years of thinking I was going to be collecting unemployment soon, because the SBIR and STTR programs are passed by law. It's legislation. So this is not an appropriation. You don't have to wait every year to know if there's going to be an SBIR appropriation. Congress passes legislation. The legislation is enacted for multiple years. The previous legislation, and there have been legislative reauthorization since 1982 for SBIR, since 1992 for STTR, and then in 2008, the authorization ended and we had 3 years of Congress fighting. Senate and House were fighting to try and figure out how to reauthorize the SBIR and STTR programs. Here's an interesting thing. Nobody said, or almost nobody said, the program should be killed. They were trying to figure out how to make them better, because overall this has been deemed to be a very successful program. That's why it's lived so long. The good news is in 2012, passed into law, signed in January of 2012, reauthorization of SBIR and STTR for 6 years. Woohoo! No unemployment for me yet. What happens with the law, though, and this is something for you to keep in mind when you leave here. How many of you have identified a solicitation that you're going to pursue in the next few months? Okay, how many are going looking at the NIH August solicitation? Okay, how about the NSF that's due in like three plus weeks? Anyone find a topic in the DoD that's currently open? Okay. How many of you, by the way, are in the life sciences, healthcare, medical, engineering-related fields, materials, energy, security? Okay, so we've got a real mix. Okay, so what happened with the, sorry, I forgot to ask that. What happened with the legislation is it got passed, but law then has to be turned into policy that can be adopted by the agency subject to the law. Who's the developer of the policy? The SBA, okay? So the SBA took the legislation, it took them a year, they wrote 2 policy directives, I'll show you where those are in a little bit. Those policy directives were passed on to the agencies, and now this year, the agencies are implementing the changes in their solicitations. So one take-home note when you leave here, those of you who raised your hands and said you're going to go after a solicitation in the next few months, you must read very carefully, because there's a lot of changes that are propagating over the coming solicitations that are incorporating reauthorization changes, okay? So the SBA doesn't award any money. They set policy, and then they adjudicate compliance to policy if there are issues that the individual agencies don't want to deal with. But other than that, their role is one of overseer, not of funder, okay? And this speaks to that gap in capital that I was talking about before, why the SBIR program exists. And just to counter something, I've been doing this for 17 years, so I don't have this problem like I did 10 years ago, but I get a lot of folks saying, why should I bother with that SBIR STTR program when I can get money elsewhere? Well, the only good thing about the lousy economy the last 5 years is you can't get money elsewhere, so I'm popular now, okay? But SBIR and STTR is an extremely compelling, from a competitive perspective, form of capital. As competitive as this program is, it is order of magnitude less competitive than going after any other funding source when you've got technical risk. So you're in the right place if you fit that category. The legislation states that for every federal agency that has an extramural research budget that exceeds a certain threshold, so any of you who've gotten an NIH grant, an NSF grant, a DoD contract, any funding to do research from one of those agencies, that's part of their extramural research budget. They are required by law to set aside, this year I think it's 2.7% of their budget to fund the SBIR program once they reach a certain threshold. The 11 agencies you see on the slide all hit that threshold. They all must set aside money to fund SBIRs. The STTR legislation is an additional set aside that 5 of the 11 agencies are subject to by law, the 5 largest. So it's for the 5 largest agencies based on their budget. So you can see that the distribution of capital is not equal. The largest agency is who? DoD, Department of Defense is the largest. They have about half of the overall SBIR, STTR budget. They are followed second by HHS, Health and Human Services. The next tier of agency below HHS, Department of Energy, NASA, National Science Foundation, who have each about $100 to $200 million. And then you've got the little agencies on your right, which don't have a lot of money, but they've got money still. And you've got agriculture, transportation, environment, commerce, education, and homeland security. And because their budgets are small, they are not subject to the STTR legislation, so they only have SBIR programs, okay? Now you might notice that you don't see NIH there at all, right? Well, it turns out HHS, Health and Human Services, the second largest agency, who have about $710 million this year actually, consist of a whole bunch of agencies. Those that participate in the SBIR program are NIH, the National Institutes of Health, the Centers for Disease Control, the Food and Drug Administration, and the Agency for Children and Families. Those are currently the 4 HHS agencies that participate in the SBIR program. Of those 4 agencies, who do you think has all the money? NIH has all the money, okay? So the vast majority is at NIH. So you tend to hear it referred to as the NIH SBIR program, and they actually administer the program on behalf of CDC, FDA, and ACF, okay? So that's our money distribution. Now here's a piece of advice, thank you, that I will provide to you relative to your behavior and the SBIR program. Our behavioral characteristics in general say, when there's 230 pages of instructions to read, I'd rather rely on my intuition, okay? Relying on intuition for SBIR and STTR is not an advisable strategy for a whole variety of reasons, okay? When you get down to the granular detail of pushing the button on electronic submission for any of the agencies, if you rely on your intuition, you're likely to get some nasty error messages. And if you did something else, which is human nature, what else do we like to do? When do we submit our proposals? Oh my God, if there was one piece of advice I could give you beyond anything else is A, don't submit at the last minute, and B, don't call a consultant and offer to spend a lot of money on them at the last minute because you just wasted the money because there's not much we can do to help you, okay? But relying on intuition when you wait till the last minute to submit a proposal because you didn't want to read the instructions is a pretty good way to get your proposal rejected. But here's another reason why you shouldn't rely on intuition. If you think that all that the Department of Defense funds is bullets and armor and aircraft carriers and tanks, you're going to be missing out on a huge chunk of money. They fund healthcare IT. They fund medical devices. They fund artificial intelligence. They fund novel materials development, and I could go on. Similarly, while NIH is focused on human health, the definition of that is very broad. Environmental technologies, hazardous waste handling, things that you wouldn't normally think of in terms of curing cancer or diagnosing heart disease fall into NIH's umbrella. And similarly, we go on with the other agencies. So it really is important that you understand who's got the money and what they want to spend it on, so you can find the right fit for what you need the money for, okay? So we're going to do a little bit of that this afternoon. This morning, I'm going to show you some resources that you can go to so that you can start to match your funding needs, your technology needs, with the agency's interests. I have a philosophy. How many of you are salespeople? The rest of you figure out how to be a salesperson, because that's really going to help you be successful. Why? Because how many of you like to solve problems? Yeah. So what do good salespeople do? Solve problems. Yeah. So when you understand what the customer's problem is, and you provide a solution to that problem, you typically consummate a sale. And if you can't provide a solution to the problem, then you've also had a success. You've said, well, thank you, I can't solve that problem. Who else might have a problem I can solve? Think of the agencies as one level of customer. Think about solving not your problem, but their problem. And when you understand what motivates them to spend their SBIR dollars in a certain way, and you can provide them with a project proposal opportunity to address their needs, that's when you're going to start to become competitive, okay? And that's why there's so much diversity in this program. No two agencies have the same format, the same proposal structure. They don't share electronic submission registrations, so there's 11 different programs, okay? Now, these 11 different programs are subject to 1, the same overarching goals, and 2, the same eligibility requirements. So what I want to do is talk about how you determine, is your project appropriate for the overall objective, federal objective of SBIR, and is your company eligible? So we're going to talk about the common things first, okay? What do you need the money for? We got to explore that a little bit more. And then as far as your company is concerned, we need to know who owns you, who controls you, and we need to assess certain resources relative to facilities and people, okay? And again, I want to give you the questions that you need to ask because you each have different opportunities, okay? And I can give you a lot of opinions, and I'm happy to talk to anybody at the break or at lunch this afternoon at 4 o'clock when we end and give you some input, what I can in 5 minutes, on your opportunity. But there's a lot more information out there than you realize to help you assess whether it's worth spending the 100 to 200 man hours it's going to take you to write a competitive proposal. before you put pencil to paper, and hence my comment about strategic planning being so important. So what I'm going to give you are some questions that I want you to leave here with. I want you to understand the rationale for those questions, but you have to answer them yourself. And you're going to answer them through a combination of homework, and then here's the third thing about intuition. About human nature. You wait till the last minute, you rely on intuition, and we believed our mothers when they told us, our fathers, don't talk to strangers. That's another really problematic thing, because there are a lot of strangers you need to talk to as you pursue SBIR in the form of agency personnel, okay? And that's, so I give you the questions, I tell you where to get the answers, and you're gonna go get the answers you need to figure out whether it's worth putting together a proposal, okay? So here's our framework. Product development. So if you have developed, you've got material science, you've identified some new material. It's got properties that all of the previous polymers are unable to do. And your SBIR is to further characterize this material. That's not an SBIR, that's a continuation of research. So you have to determine how you're going to turn the material into some type of product. So we have to focus on product number one. Number two, it has to be based on technological innovation. And when I asked you the question before, how many of you are sure that the technology will work, and many of you raised your hands. If that is truly the case, there's no technical risk. Why is the government giving you free money? Because they want to fill a gap. And if you don't have technical risk, then don't come to the government for free money. Go get the other monies that are out there already to help address the other types of business and market risk. So if you truly have zero technical risk, no technical innovation, actually that's the good news. It's one less piece of risk you have to deal with in your companies. But it just means you're not appropriate for SBIR. But none of it makes any difference. The most risky technologies in the most compelling product is not appropriate if you can't tell me, contingent upon achieving your technical goals, how you will commercialize. Because what's the goal of SBIR? And I'm sorry, I'm going to ask you another 15 times today, because you're going to all leave here and you're going to forget that, and you're going to focus on writing the science, because that's what the money is used for, okay? So this is what we're going to look at a little bit. So from a product development perspective, here are some questions to ask yourself. What is the product? We see common issues time and again when we look at proposals, and one of the common issues is failure to truly articulate what the product is, particularly when the technology comes out of an academic institution, so it's based on basic science. The ability to focus on what the product is sometimes a problem. So what's the product? What will it be used for? Because now you may have multiple applications that either cross agencies or within an agency. For example, within an agency that's complex like NIH, you may have multiple applications and have multiple different points where you can enter NIH. So understanding what the applications are and which one you choose to focus on is important. The next two are very important relative to how you get the money, over what time frame, and how you use it. What have you already done? What's left to do? And you'll see why those two questions are so important in a minute when I show you the way that an SBIR, STTR award is staged and over what period of time, okay? I've got a timeline up here. The top line is my timeline. So I want you to write a song in your head, and I apologize for my really bad singing, and it's an old song, but it goes something like the following. If I had $1 million, I would do some R&D. So I want you to write that song in your head. I want you to take actually $1.5 million. So use as a guideline $1.5 million over a period of 3 to 3.5 years. And when you get the first dollar, you're really high technical risk. And when you've spent the $1.5 million over 3 to 3.5 years, you've reduced substantially the technical risk. But here's the deal. For each of your projects in each agency, where you start and where you finish has a lot of flexibility. So point B on my timeline is when you get your first SBIR dollar for this project, and point C is 3.5 years later when you've spent your $1.5 million. But point A, which is all the way to your left, is when you had your great idea. And for some of you, it was over a beer the other night. And for others of you, you've been working for 3 years to collect a lot of data to support your hypothesis or your idea. On the other end, point D is when you commercialize. For some of you, who's developing software or IT? Yeah, so sometimes software and IT is not even amenable to SBIR because of the timeframes. But if it is, sometimes at the end of a phase 2 SBIR, you're almost ready to go to market. Anyone in here doing therapeutics? Yeah, I hope I'm retired before your product gets to market, because it's going to take that many years downstream, okay? So my point is, depending on the agency, and almost everything with SBIR has the caveat of depending on the agency. Depending on the agency and your project, you want to have something you've already done to support the high-risk nature of what you're about to do, so that's what we call preliminary data. You've got 3 years and $1.5 million to reduce technical risk. And then the ultimate goal is commercialization, but for some of you, it will be shortly after your SBIR funding is done, and for others of you, it will be many more millions of dollars, maybe some more SBIRs before you get to market. And depending on the agency, either one of those scenarios can fit. Just like any other investor, and make no mistake about it, the federal government is investing in you. They just don't expect their return in the form of money back. They expect their return in the form of impact in the market for commercialization. But they are investing in you. And if what you're doing is high risk, yeah? Am I going to give you the whole $1.5 million at once? No, I'm not. So the way that they crafted the program is as follows. An SBIR project has 3 phases, and I will loosely define the phases for you. Phase 1, feasibility. We call that the F word. You have to have the F word in your project. Phase 1 is feasibility. It's typically 6 months. It's typically $150,000. Those are guidelines. Each agency will implement those a little differently. But loosely, you've got 6 months, $150,000 to demonstrate feasibility. Feasibility of what? This is an interesting question. Typically, it's the feasibility of whatever the next chunk of work you want to do is, which is phase 2, and it's 2 years, and order of magnitude $1 million to $1.5 million over 2 years. So you've got phase 1 feasibility, $150,000 to $225,000 for 6 months, followed by phase 2 further R&D, 2 years and $1 million and $1.5 million, and phase 3 is commercialization, the long-term goal. That $2.5 billion pot of money that the federal government set aside in those 11 agencies can only be spent on phase 1 and phase 2 portions of the project. Phase 3 must require non-SBIR STTR funds. So wherever you get the additional funding to achieve commercialization, whether you have revenue, whether you raise other forms of capital, whether you've got strategic partners that provide the resources, whatever it is, you have to articulate how you're going to achieve commercialization, what resources you'll need, where you'll get them from, before I will give you a phase 1, $150,000, 6-month award to demonstrate feasibility. Now, how we define our project and break it up into 2 parts, phase 1, phase 2, is somewhat agency dependent. And you're going to learn in a little bit about the 2 different types of agencies. There are agencies that provide you with the specifics of what the project needs to be. And there are agencies where you tell them what the project's going to be. And that's going to help figure out who decides how to split up their phase 1 and phase 2. In some cases you do, and in some cases the agencies do. But in all cases, you have to have a phase 1 feasibility study to support the phase 2 further R&D. Okay? Now usually there's some questions at this point. There's a couple, anyone got any questions? Yes, sir.
How does the federal funding fit in with state funding?
Oh, that's not, so the federal funding is, fits in as part of a funding strategy where you may have state funding, you might have revenue, you might have other equity investment, but the project that you develop with SBIR and STTR funds must be able to be done with just the SBIR dollars, okay? So you may be able to get, some states have matching funds, and those matching funds for SBIR programs can be used for costs that are not allowable by SBIR, but we never cost share SBIRs. But because it's only focused on R&D, any other monies you can get for any other activities in your company, dilutive or non-dilutive, are going to help you make a stronger case for how you're going to commercialize. Okay?
What happens if you've gone through phase one?
That's the question I typically get, so I figured somebody had it. So if you think you've already demonstrated feasibility, right, is what you're, I'm already past the feasibility stage. There's going to be a, depending on the agency, so let me give you a little precursor of what's coming. Some agencies define phase one and phase two for you, in which case you look at what they want and you either say, I can do it or I can't. And so that side of the equation, which includes Department of Defense, Department of Homeland Security, NASA, and we'll come back to that. It's kind of a non-relevant question because they're going to define it for you, and you're going to respond either, yes, I can develop that prototype, or you won't respond. But for agencies like NIH, NSF, Department of Energy, which is what we refer to as investigator-initiated agencies, you get to define feasibility. So I turn the question back to you. Do you still have at least 3 years and at least $1.5 million worth of work to go from high technical risk to low technical risk?
Yeah.
If the answer is yes, then everything you've done already is what we call preliminary data. And now you just take that next chunk of work and divide it into 2 phases. And now we put a hat on, and that hat is our reviewer hat. And we say, so if this is risky, and I want my $1.5 million to develop this piece of software, which is going to take this huge amount of data and make some kind of predictions for health outcomes, what's the part that the reviewers are going to say, seriously? You really think you can do that? Wow, that's pretty challenging from a technical perspective, and you carve out your first feasibility study for the next chunk of work. What can you do in $150,000 in 6 months to collect the next chunk of data to get the reviewers confident enough to then come back to them and ask them for the R&D, the phase 2?
Is $150,000 fixed?
Depends on the agency. So the question was, is $150,000 fixed? And it depends on the agency, okay? Every agency will provide a cap. And so when we go through a couple of the agency examples, some give you less. The current federal cap, which was just implemented with reauthorization, is not to exceed $225,000. So the maximum you're going to see is $225,000, but the guideline that the federal government sets is $150,000, and some agencies set caps below that, and some, like NIH, will let you go up to the $225,000. Yes, ma'am. So the question is, do you have to get your patent? And that's a very good question. There are no rules, number one, that you have to have any intellectual property from an SBIR perspective. Number two, when you develop intellectual property and when you protect it is a business decision, okay? What you have to have with SBIR is a credible commercialization strategy. The vast majority of projects funded under SBIR generate intellectual property in the forms of patents, sometimes copyrights. The more robust your patent protection, the more viable your commercialization strategy. But there is no rule that says you have to have patents before you can apply for SBIR and STTR. The other side note with patents to be careful of is oftentimes SBIR companies are developing technologies that they don't own the patents to. If you are a university spin-out, typically who owns the intellectual property? The university. And you've got to, at some point, license it. So the corollary to this question is, do I have to have a license to the intellectual property before I can write my SBIRs? And the short answer, and by the way, there's always short answers and long answers, but the short answer is no, you don't. But at a minimum, you have to have the rights to do R&D with that IP, and preferentially, you have at least started discussions with the Intellectual Property Office, the Office of Tech Transfer, and at a minimum, maybe gotten an option. Okay, but those discussions have to have started. But in many cases, it's too early to execute a license, so you have to demonstrate through your proposal and your commercialization strategy that you've entered into discussions to get the rights to the IP. Yes, sir?
What's the timetable from application to award to funding?
Yeah, so the timetable from application to award to funding. First of all, what's the first part of the answer to every question? Depends on the agency, okay? On average, it's 6 months. Okay, and there's a goal for reauthorization. All agencies, with the exception of NIH and NSF, are supposed to make a decision within 90 days and an award within 180 days. Those are two different things. The only agencies that are exempt from that are NSF and NIH. NSF already does that. They make awards within 6 months. So, pardon me, is anyone here from NIH? They're the bad apple in the bunch because they are very, very slow. They are working hard to speed things up, but with NIH, it can be upwards of a year. Okay, yes, sir.
What if the cost for phase two commercialization is more than $1.5 million. Is there a cap on how much you can ask for?
So let me clarify, with phase two, it isn't commercialization, it's more R&D. Phase three is commercialization. So we're still doing R&D in phase two, but yes, there is a cap with reauthorization. The most that you can request is 1.5 million. Some agencies will not even let you get $1 million. So it's agency dependent, just like with the phase one. So again, think of your timeline, and when we talk about the agencies, you're going to see, for those agencies that define phase one and phase two for you, they presumably have proposed work that's achievable in the time frame in the budget. If you go to an agency like NIH or NSF and you propose the project, you have to craft your project so that the work can be reasonably done in 6 months in the budget for phase one and 2 years in the budget for phase two, which might mean you're not done yet at the end of phase two, and that's okay. But you have to be cognizant of the budgets and the time frames, okay? Yes, sir?
Can you get to D in 2 years?
Can you get to?
D in 2 years?
Oh, can you get to D in 2 years? So that's an interesting question. You can, but not intentionally. And this is the reason why I say this. If you know that you can get to commercialization in 2 years for less than the amount of money, you're probably not in the right place for SBIR. These are for projects that going in, you're pretty confident is going to take this period of time and this amount of money. Okay? And by the way, please note there's a gap between phase one and phase two. So you write a phase one proposal, you submit it, it gets reviewed, in a happy world it gets funded. You go in your lab, you do the work for 6 months, you get great results, you write your phase two, you submit the proposal, it has to go through that 180 to 6 month review period, and then the phase two gets funded. And that's 2 years. So we're probably talking at a minimum 3.5 to 4 years from the time you start to write your phase one to when you complete a phase two. Now here's the deal. If I had $100 for every single client who said, you know what, that takes too long, I'm going to go get money elsewhere, and then they come back 1.5 years later and say, I never got any other money, don't you wish you'd put those proposals in? Strategically, you look at the agency, the fit with the agency cycle, the strategy for working with them, and you start now. And you will be shocked. If you're developing technologies that are risky enough and challenging enough, trust me, it's going to take you longer than you think, it's going to cost more money than you think, and getting that SBIR or STTR funding into your company provides validation that other investors are going to value highly and help facilitate your partnerships and other fundraising. And I'll take one more question and then I'm going to move on. Yes, sir?
Did you apply for phase two directly?
No. So the question is, that's the other question corollary to this gentleman's question that I usually get at this stage is, can I skip phase one and go to directly phase two? The answer currently is no, you can't. Every agency requires a phase one as the eligibility for phase two. But here are two things with reauthorization that are changing. Number one, Congress passed as part of reauthorization the provision for agencies to develop direct to phase two programs. The only agency that is thinking about doing it, to my knowledge right now, is NIH. They don't do it yet. They're talking about a very small pilot. So do not expect to see any direct to phase twos in the near future. The other thing that happened with reauthorization is the ability to go from one agency to the other from phase one to phase two. I don't know whether we'll see that in practical implementation either. But reauthorization is allowing it. There's a lot of things in reauthorization that everyone thought were going to be done deals, and it turns out they are now allowable, but the agencies have to opt in, and very few of the agencies are opting into some of these provisions at this point. Okay? Okay. Well, I fib. I'll take one more question, then I'm going to keep going, and then we'll stop again. I opened up the floodgates of questions, which is great. Yes, sir.
When you submit a proposal, is that published? That is, if you submit something and coming back to patent protection, maybe there are elements of that proposal that you don't want spread around, how much?
So this is another very good question. Is your proposal publicly available? The short answer is no, it is not. Submissions of SBIRs and STTRs are not public disclosures, and they are not ever provided publicly. Here's a couple of exceptions. Number one, you must read the agency's instructions, so remember that intuition is bad. For marking proprietary or privileged information, each agency will tell you how to do it, okay? That ensures confidentiality for you. Number two, for the agencies that use external peer review, all peer reviewers sign non-disclosures, confidentiality agreements, okay? Number three, if you are not funded, nothing is made publicly available. If you are funded, the abstract, which should never contain proprietary or privileged information, will be available publicly, which, by the way, is where we're going to in a minute, because how cool is that? You can read abstracts of every project that every agency has funded. Talk about a good way to do homework, okay? So, and then the last piece to your question, which just became relevant again yesterday for me, was some agencies will accept FOIA requests for full proposals. We just literally had a client call us yesterday, said NIH has had a FOIA request, Freedom of Information Act request, to release my proposals. What does NIH do? And they did exactly what I had just told someone they did, thank goodness, is number one, all those parts that you marked as proprietary or privileged are redacted. And then number two, they contact you. And they tell you that someone has requested your proposal, do you want to redact anything else? So that by the time it's released, it doesn't look like much more than an abstract, okay? Okay, and some agencies, by the way, won't accept a FOIA request, and that's a question I can't answer. I don't know why, it's puzzling to me. There's a new omnibus solicitation that will be released in the next week or so. I literally had an email from them yesterday. It will adopt the VC rule. That says that if you are owned by more than one, so two or more venture capital operating companies, hedge funds, or private equity funds, and no individual investor owns, institutional investor owns more than 50%, then you will be eligible to apply to NIH, okay? The other agencies are not opting in. If any of you have any questions on this, see me afterwards. It's going to apply to a very small minority of companies, but it is being adopted by NIH, okay? So that's our ownership. Affiliation. Affiliation speaks to control. If there is another organization that could potentially control you, then you're affiliated with them. And here's an easy to understand example, shared management. So I spin my company out of Stony Brook, okay? And they look at me and they say, well, Lisa, you're really smart and you're a really good engineer. I'm an engineer by training, actually not a very good one, but don't tell anyone. You're a very good engineer, but you don't know anything about business. But we'd like to introduce you to Matt here. Matt's a serial entrepreneur. He is an executive in residence, and he can be working up for our equity, for our license to you. We take a little equity. We're going to put Matt on your board. But Matt is also, because we don't trust your business sense, going to be your interim CEO. Cool. Don't want to deal with the business stuff. But I say, Matt, how many other companies are you interim CEO of? Oh, well, as an EIR, I got 4 other companies I'm acting as CEO. I'm now affiliated with all those other companies. So common management creates an affiliation, and now I've got to look at all the companies that Matt is CEO of and count all the employees. If he happens to be CEO of Pfizer, I got a problem. If he's CEO of 4 other startups, I'm good. That's one example of affiliation. There are actually 9, and if you go to the size rules, you'll see them all listed. Okay, but if you think about, do I have anybody else that is involved with my company that could potentially control me, that would trigger an affiliation.
What about board membership?
Board membership, unless they have controlling votes, does not necessarily trigger an affiliation. And that's been specifically defined by reauthorization. So it's not just composition of the board, it's control. Consulting relationships are typically not an issue, okay? So it's shared management. It's if you have an existing business and you're selling widgets and you've got one customer that you're selling 95% of your widgets to, that could potentially be an affiliation, okay? So it's things like, because they could potentially control you because I have 95% of your business, so I'm telling you what to do. So that's where the affiliation comes in, okay? All right, here's one that causes some companies problems, particularly those, and you will not find this directly called out in eligibility rules, but it is, make no mistake about it, and we'll talk in a little bit about fraud, waste, and abuse in the SBIR program. Here's a real gotcha, okay? The rule is as follows. I'm going to tell you what the rule is, and then I'm going to break it down. You must have, at the time of award, company-controlled research facilities suitable to do the work proposed. Now, let me define some things. Number 1, who is the only eligible organization to apply for SBIR and STTR? Small business. That small business, therefore, must have facilities in which to conduct their work, okay? That small business must also have at least 1 employee, and an employee is paid on a W-2, not a 1099, in order to do the company's work. In all cases, both SBIR and STTR, the company has to do some of the work. Interestingly, the company doesn't have to do all of the work, and we're going to define some in a minute. But the reason why I don't define it now is that's one of the differences between SBIR and STTR. So I'm going to come to that in just a minute. But for all of you, SBIR or STTR, the company must do some of the work. That work must be done in a company-controlled research facility. So company-controlled says you lease it, you sublease it, you own it. But if I've got a lab, I'm a researcher at Stony Brook, and I've got a lab and part of it's empty, and I say, well, why should I go to the incubator and rent space? I just set my company up here. Who controls that space? Stony Brook, so it's not company controlled. So you have to have a lease or a sublease. Research facilities. There's a business incubator down the road. You get an address, you get a copy machine, you get a shared conference room. Is that research facility? No. Has to be where you're going to conduct your R&D. And then the last piece is suitable to do the work proposed. So if you're a wet lab company developing high-throughput screening technologies for drug discovery, your suitable facility is very different than if you're an IT company where you might need an 8x10 cubicle with 2 computers and a Coke machine down the hall. So it's, what are you doing? Do you have a facility that's in your control at the time of the award and for the duration of the award where your one or more employees can do the work that you're going to get the money for? And when you get the money, guess what you have to do? Have your employee do work in that facility. And if the Inspector General of one of the agencies happens to drive by and say, wow, that place doesn't look like anyone's doing any work, it's empty. Guess what you've just done? You've broken the law again, okay? Anyone have questions on company-controlled research facilities? This is a very common gotcha. And when I look at proposals, one of the first things I do is not read your research strategy. I look at your budget justification, your facilities and resources, and your biographical sketches or list of people. Because I want to see if you're a real company. And for SBIR, a real company says you've got facilities. Yes, sir?
How about facilities where there's shared resources?
It can't be only shared facilities or you've got a problem. You have to have your own little piece of turf. Incubators are Abu Dhabi for SBIR companies because they provide a whole bunch of shared resource which just builds the infrastructure of your company, but also typically provide you with your own little piece of space. That's compliant. Okay? But what you can't do is say, well, for the vast majority of the time, the three of us pharmaceutical geniuses sit at Starbucks and we manage all of our CROs, but yes, we send one of our scientists into this rented facility once a week to run a study. That won't be compliant. Yes, sir?
What about a company that has one or more people working, each working at home, and everything they do can be communicated through online communications, and all they need is a computer? They're not making a product.
Okay, so, well, they are making product, I hope, or they're not doing SBIR, but the product can be software,
Yeah.
okay? So the scenario is, what if I have a bunch of different people working out of their house because we're a software company? So, and that's fine, because their house is typically is controlled, okay? Let me just take my answer to that question one step further. We have two R's. We have rules, and we have reviewers. The scenario this gentleman raised will satisfy the rules. It may or may not, depending on the agency and the company and what you're doing, satisfy the reviewers, okay? So you always have to look at, do I meet the rules? But then what are the reviewers going to look at relative to what I'm doing now, where I intend to end up, and do I have the right resources to get there? And sometimes working out of your house is a generic statement, will be very problematic for reviewers depending on the project and the company, okay? Okay. So company-controlled research facilities suitable to do the work proposed. We've got one more eligibility rule as it pertains to our principal investigator, but now this is applied differently for SBIR and STTR, so this is a good time for us to talk about the difference between those two mechanisms. You've already seen one difference. I showed you in a slide earlier that only 5 of the 11 agencies that are subject to SBIR legislation are also subject to the STTR legislation. So it's 2 separate sets of legislation with 2 separate set-asides, and not everyone participates. Once you choose a mechanism, and sometimes you can choose, and sometimes the agency essentially dictates which mechanism based on what technical topics they put in. But once you pick, you have to meet the rules. There are 2 right now agencies that give you the flexibility to pick which mechanism you want. Those are NIH and Department of Energy. To some extent, NSF does with their current solicitations, but there's a little nuance there that we'll talk about this afternoon. Last year, they didn't give you the choice because they had different technical topics. So sometimes you have the choice, sometimes you don't. But when you respond to a solicitation, you have to meet the requirements of that solicitation. It will either be an SBIR or an STTR solicitation, and you have to meet the requirements, so you need to understand what those are. Now here's the deal. Congress was kind of smart when they set up this program. They said, we want the money to only go to small businesses. This is a small business program, but we recognize that when you're developing technologies, you may not have everything you need to get the work done. You may not have sophisticated equipment that you only need for a limited amount of time and would make no sense for you to purchase. You may not have all of the scientific and technical expertise that you need on staff, but you might need to get just small bits of different pieces of technical expertise. So when they created the SBIR program, they allowed for outsourcing. Now, outsourcing is done essentially in one of two ways. So I've already said you have to have a company-controlled research facility with at least one technical person working for the company. But now, with SBIR, if you decide you need to bring on some consultants, so I need an individual to provide me with input on how to do the statistical analysis of my data, so I'm going to hire a statistician. I'm going to pay him $1,000 a day for 4 days of advice. That's a consultant that's outsourced, because that's not my employee. I need Stony Brook to run animal studies in the animal facility with my material. That's a subcontract, because I'm now hiring an institution to do work with their personnel in their facility. And when we do detailed training by agency, and we do a lot of detailed agency training, we talk about budgets and how to develop the specifics of the budget. But for where we are now, think about anything you need to outsource in the form of consultants or subcontractors. And SBIR allows you to do that if you need to, but it doesn't require it. So you don't have to if you have everything you need, but you can if you want. And I'm going to define those in a minute. STTR came along a little while later, and STTR had a very specific goal. The goal was, because SBIR at that point was around 10 years and was already deemed to be very successful. So Congress said, but look at all these universities. Anyone know what BIDOL is? BIDOL is the act that was passed that allowed institutions that got federal funding to own the ensuing intellectual property, right? That was passed in 1980. So who took big advantage of that? Universities. Now they started tech transfer offices and could own all the IP that was developed as a result of their research. So now it's 1990, 91, and Congress says, look at this SBIR program. It's going pretty well. What if we could throw a little more money at it and encourage small businesses to collaborate with nonprofit research institutions? So the STTR program was passed, and now it requires a collaboration. That collaboration is between the small business and a nonprofit research institution, typically a university, but not always, so based on where we're at, let's say that's Stony Brook, okay? The applicant is still always who? Small business, but now I enter into a sponsored research agreement, a subcontract with the university to collaborate with me. So SBIR allows but doesn't require, STTR requires a collaboration. So that gives us two other differences. One has to do with this definition of sum, and then we're going to talk about PI. So now the answer to the gentleman's question about outsourcing a human subject study. In an SBIR, you are allowed but not required to outsource up to 1/3 of the work of a phase 1 and up to half of the work of a phase 2. And those ratios are determined by budget. Now, 1/3, those are fractions, right? I'll come to your question in just a minute. Those are fractions, so there's a numerator and a denominator. The numerator is always the sum of how much you're spending on consultants and subcontractors. The denominator may vary depending on the agency. Typically, it's total costs. So in a $200,000 phase 1 SBIR, you have up to, but not exceeding, $67,000 that you can spend on consultants and subcontractors. In a $1 million phase 2, you've got up to $500,000. So now, if you can get your human subjects work done within those budgets, you're totally fine with SBIR. Just remembering that the company has to spend $133,000 of the phase 1 and at least $500,000 of the phase 2. That's our SBIR. In an STTR, how many organizations do we have collaborating at a minimum now? 2. Who's the applicant? Thank you. Sorry, I know I might sound a little patronizing, but you'd be surprised how many universities still think they can apply for STTRs. So small business applies. They must do at least 40% of the work. The primary nonprofit collaborator must do at least 30% of the work. And that leaves us no more than 30% of the work that can be done by either one of those organizations or others. So now in my $200,000 phase 1, I've got to spend at least $80,000. Stony Brook has to spend at least $60,000. And that leaves us the remaining 60,000 that I can spend, that they can spend, or that we can bring in other consultants or subcontractors. And those ratios hold for phase twos. So in an SBIR, it's a not to exceed, and in an STTR, it's minimum levels of effort by each party. Make sense? Okay, so let me ask you a question, then I'm gonna go there and come around here. When do you think is a smart time to work on your budget? Early.